The knife was already at her throat before Elena understood she had walked into a trap. She had come to the eastern hall of the Blackwood estate to deliver a message from the border patrol, nothing more. A simple errand any Luna might perform on an ordinary evening. Instead, she found a stranger waiting in the shadows behind the tapestry, his breath smelling of iron and old anger, his hand closing around her wrist with a grip that promised to break bone if she screamed. "Not a sound," the man whispered, "or the Alpha King loses his wife before he ever learns to appreciate her." Elena's heart slammed against her ribs, but her mind, trained by 3 years of quiet survival in a house full of people who barely looked at her, stayed sharp. She let her body go soft, let her eyes go wide and frightened, exactly the picture of the powerless bride everyone in this pack believed her to be. Then, when his grip loosened for half a second, she drove her elbow into his stomach and twisted free, screaming a warning through the halls that shook the ancient stone. Guards came running. The stranger fled through a servant's passage before anyone could catch him. But the message was clear enough. Someone wanted Elena gone, and they had chosen tonight, of all nights, to try. Zollery. Damon arrived last, as he always did, his golden eyes scanning the hall with the detached calculation of a king assessing damage to his territory rather than a husband afraid for his wife. "Report," he said to the guard captain, not to Elena. "An intruder, my lord." Wolf scent. Unfamiliar. He came within a breath of the Luna. Damon's jaw tightened, but when his gaze finally landed on Elena, standing pale and trembling by the tapestry, there was no warmth in it, only the cold arithmetic of a man calculating political consequences. "You're certain you're unharmed?" "I'm fine," Elena said, and hated herself for how steady her voice sounded, as though 3 years of practice had taught her to hide every crack. "Good. This cannot get out. If the northern packs learn our security was breached, they'll see weakness." He turned to his guard captain, already moving on. "Double the watch. I want answers by morning." He walked away without another word, without a hand on her shoulder, without asking if she needed water or rest or simply someone to sit beside her while her pulse slowed. Elena watched his back retreat down the corridor and felt something in her chest, some small, stubborn hope she hadn't even realized she still carried, quietly close its eyes and die. It had not always felt this empty. When the elders first arranged the marriage between the Blackwood pack and the Thornfield pack, Elena had been 18, terrified and secretly thrilled. Damon Blackwood was young for an alpha, barely 23, but already carried himself like a man who had never once doubted his own authority. On their wedding day, standing beneath an arch of white roses, Elena had looked at his sharp jaw and unreadable eyes and thought, foolishly, that perhaps duty could grow into something warmer, given time. She remembered the wedding night most clearly, not for any romance, but for the conversation that followed the ceremony, once the guests had gone and the two of them stood alone in his private study. "I want to be honest with you," Damon had said, pouring himself a drink without offering her one. "This marriage exists to end a war that has cost both our packs generations of grief. I respect that. I will protect you as I would protect any member of this pack, but I will not pretend to feelings I do not have." "I understand," Elena had answered, because what else was there to say to a king on the first night of her marriage? "Good. I think we'll manage well enough, as long as we're both clear-eyed about what this is." She had gone to bed that night in a room down the hall from his, alone, and told herself that clarity was better than false promises. She had believed, in her naive 18-year-old heart, that respect could be a foundation sturdy enough to build something on. 3 years later, standing in a corridor with a stranger's fingerprints still bruising her wrist, she understood how wrong she had been. The pack physician, a soft-spoken older woman named Margaret, insisted on examining her despite Elena's protests that she was fine. Margaret's hands were gentle as she checked the bruising along Elena's wrist, but her eyes were sharp with concern that had nothing to do with physical injury. "You've been like this a long time, haven't you?" Margaret said quietly, not really a question. "Like what?" "Fine. Always fine. Even when you're not." Elena said nothing, because saying something would have meant admitting things she had spent 3 years refusing to admit even to herself. Margaret finished wrapping a light bandage around her wrist and sat back, studying her with the patience of someone who had tended wounds both visible and hidden for decades. "The Alpha King is a good leader, strong, fair with the pack. But being strong for a pack and being present for a wife are not the same skill, and I fear no one has ever taught him the difference." "He has a great deal on his mind," Elena said, the same excuse she had offered herself 1,000 times. "He does. And you have carried the weight of his absence for 3 years without complaint. That is not strength, dear girl. That is exhaustion wearing strength's clothing." The words landed harder than Elena expected, striking some tender place she had kept carefully guarded. She thanked Margaret and walked back to her room alone, past the closed door of Damon's study where she could hear his voice, low and familiar, speaking with someone inside. She recognized the second voice immediately, the warm, teasing laugh that had become as constant a fixture in this house as the stone walls themselves. Vivian. Elena did not stop to listen. She had learned long ago that listening only deepened the wound. She continued to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed staring at the bruises forming on her wrist, wondering how close she had come tonight to disappearing entirely from a life that had already begun forgetting her. Sleep did not come easily. She lay awake replaying the stranger's whispered threat, wondering who would want her gone badly enough to break into a fortified estate, and why. She was not naive enough to believe it was random. Someone had known the exact hour she would walk that corridor alone. Someone inside these walls, perhaps, had made that possible. Around midnight, unable to bear the silence any longer, she rose and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds, half lit by torchlight. Below, a group of young Omega Wolves were practicing defensive positions under the supervision of an older warrior named Nathaniel, one of the few pack members who had always treated Elena with something resembling genuine warmth. She watched them for a long while, watched Nathaniel patiently correct a young girl's stance, watched the girl's face light up at his encouragement, and felt a strange ache in her chest at witnessing kindness so freely given to someone else. She thought about her own training, or rather the lack of it. When she first arrived at the Blackwood estate, she had asked Damon if she might learn to defend herself properly, beyond the basic etiquette lessons expected of Eluna. He had waved the request aside, telling her that the pack's warriors existed precisely so she would never need such skills. At the time, she had accepted this as a kind of protection. Tonight, with her wrist throbbing and her husband more concerned with political optics than her well-being, the memory felt less like protection and more like a cage dressed up in pretty language. A soft knock came at her door sometime past 1 in the morning. Elena opened it to find Grace, her personal attendant and closest thing to a friend within these walls, standing with a tray of tea and an expression of quiet worry. "I heard what happened," Grace said, slipping inside and setting the tray down. "I couldn't sleep until I saw you were truly all right." "I'm all right," Elena said, and this time, alone with someone who actually seemed to care about the honest answer, she let her voice waver just slightly on the words. Grace poured the tea and sat beside her, saying nothing for a long moment, simply offering the comfort of presence. "Do you know who it was? The one who attacked you?" "No. A stranger. Unfamiliar scent," the guard said. "Strange that a stranger could get so close, in a house guarded this heavily." "That's what worries me," Elena admitted. "It felt planned, deliberate, as though someone wanted me specifically, in that hallway, at that hour." Grace's brow furrowed. "You don't think—" She hesitated, glancing toward the door as though afraid of being overheard. "Think what?" "Nothing. Forget I said anything." But the flicker of suspicion in Grace's eyes told Elena that some name had crossed her friend's mind, some possibility too dangerous to speak aloud within these walls. Elena did not press her. She had learned patience in this house, the slow, careful patience of a woman who had spent 3 years reading between lines because the truth was rarely spoken to her directly. Whatever Grace suspected, she would learn it eventually. For now, she simply drank her tea and let herself feel, for a few quiet minutes, less alone. When Grace finally left, Elena lay back down and stared at the ceiling, turning over the events of the evening. A stranger with a blade at her throat, a husband who cared more for appearances than her safety, a friend too frightened to voice a suspicion. And somewhere down the hall, behind a closed study door, a woman whose laughter had grown louder in this house, with every year that Elena's own voice had grown quieter. She thought of the wedding vows she had made 3 years ago, vows about partnership and protection, that had somehow, slowly, been rewritten into something closer to servitude and silence. She thought about the young girl on the training grounds below, learning to defend herself, learning that her own strength mattered. Elena realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had never once been taught that lesson. She had been taught instead to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way, to interpret neglect as duty and coldness as strength. Something shifted in her that night, something small but unmistakable, like the first hairline crack spreading through ice that had seemed solid for years. She did not know yet what that crack would become. She only knew that a blade against her throat had shown her, in the space of a single terrifying moment, exactly how much her own life was worth to the people around her, and exactly how little effort anyone besides Grace and Margaret had made to protect it. Morning came gray and overcast, rain threatening along the horizon. Elena rose early, dressed without waiting for her attendants, and made her way to the training grounds before the household had fully woken. Nathaniel was already there, going through forms alone in the mist. He straightened when he saw her approaching, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "My Luna, you're up early." "I want to learn," Elena said, before she could talk herself out of it. "Everything. Defense, awareness, how to read a threat before it reaches me. Will you teach me?" Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, taking in the faint bruise still visible at her wrist, the new steadiness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Something like respect passed across his features. "It won't be easy," he said, "and it won't be quick." "I have time," Elena answered, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she meant it as a promise to herself, rather than an excuse for someone else's absence. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words could have. "Then we begin now." As the first gray light of dawn spread over the training grounds, Elena took her stance, feet planted, shoulders squared, and began to learn the first true lesson of her new life. Somewhere inside the estate, behind closed doors, Damon Blackwood was already deep in conversation about border patrols and political alliances, utterly unaware that the quiet, dutiful wife he had left standing alone in a corridor the night before had just taken the first step toward becoming someone he would no longer recognize. He did not know it yet, but the woman he had married out of duty was beginning, finally, to build a life that belonged entirely to herself. 3 weeks after the attack in the Eastern Hall, Elena stood in the training yard, with her knuckles raw and her breath coming hard, blocking a strike from Nathaniel that would have knocked her flat only a week earlier. She did not celebrate. She simply reset her stance and waited for the next attempt, the way he had taught her, always ready, never satisfied. "Better," Nathaniel said, lowering his arms. "Much better." "Not good enough," Elena answered, wiping sweat from her brow. "Good enough is a moving target, my Luna. You'll never catch it, and you shouldn't try. Progress is the only honest measure." She nodded, grateful for his steadiness, and thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that a warrior twice her age had become more of a confidant than the man she had married. Damon had not asked once in 3 weeks how her wrist had healed. He had not asked whether the guards had found any trace of the intruder, though Elena knew from Grace that the investigation had quietly stalled, buried beneath more pressing matters of border disputes and trade negotiations. What Damon had noticed in those 3 weeks was Vivian. Elena saw them together nearly every evening now, strolling the eastern gardens after supper, heads bent close in conversation that never seemed to run dry. Vivian had returned to the Blackwood Pack 8 months earlier, officially to serve as an advisor on matters concerning the Ashgrove territories, where she had spent years building trade relationships before her return. Unofficially, everyone in the household understood exactly what her presence meant, though no one dared speak it aloud in Elena's hearing. Vivian was beautiful in the effortless way of someone who had never once doubted her own worth. Dark hair always perfectly arranged, laughter always pitched, just loud enough to carry across a room and remind everyone present of her existence. She was clever too, undeniably so, with a sharp political mind that Damon relied on more with each passing month. Elena did not hate her for her cleverness. She hated, if she allowed herself the honesty of the word, the ease with which Vivian occupied space that should have belonged to a wife. That evening, Elena found herself walking the same garden path an hour before Damon and Vivian's usual stroll, drawn by some restless energy she could not quite name. She stopped near the old stone fountain at the garden's center, the one Damon's grandmother had commissioned decades earlier, and let the sound of falling water settle her thoughts. "You're out here alone again," a voice said behind her, and Elena turned to find Grace approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "I like the quiet," Elena said. "You like it? Or you've grown used to it because no one gives you a choice?" Elena managed a small, tired smile. Perhaps both. Grace settled onto the stone bench beside the fountain, studying her friend with the careful attention of someone who had watched this particular sadness deepen over many months without quite knowing how to address it. "I spoke with one of the kitchen staff today. She mentioned Lady Vivian requested a private supper be arranged for tomorrow evening, in the small dining room. Just for two." Elena felt something tighten in her chest, though she had long since trained her face not to show it. That's not unusual. They discuss trade matters often. At 9 in the evening, with wine specifically requested, and the staff dismissed for the night once the meal is served? The implication settled over Elena like cold water. She said nothing for a long moment, watching the fountain's water catch the last orange light of sunset. "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. "I only tell you because I think you deserve to know, not to hurt you." "I know," Elena said. "Thank you for trusting me with it." That night, Elena did not sleep. She lay awake turning over the small, cumulative injuries of 3 years, each one insignificant on its own, all of them together forming a weight she had somehow carried without collapsing beneath it. The missed anniversaries. The empty seat at dinner more nights than not. The way Damon's eyes would soften only ever in Vivian's direction, never hers. She was not naive enough to believe her marriage had ever been built on love, but she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that respect and loyalty might have been enough to sustain it. Watching that belief crumble, piece by piece, hurt more than she had expected. The following evening, curiosity and a stubborn, aching need to understand her own situation clearly drove Elena toward the small dining room earlier than the appointed hour. She told herself she only wanted to confirm what Grace had heard, nothing more, though some quieter part of her already understood she was searching for a wound she intended to press against deliberately, if only to finally feel something other than numbness. She did not enter the room. She stood instead in the shadowed alcove just outside its door, where a servant might pause before announcing a guest, and listen to the low murmur of voices within. "He still hasn't chosen a proper air strategy," Vivian was saying, her tone light, almost teasing. "The council grows impatient, Damon. They want reassurance about the succession." "The council can wait," Damon answered, and Elena heard, unmistakably, the particular warmth in his voice that never once appeared when he spoke to her. "I've told you before, these things take time." "Time you don't seem inclined to spend with your wife," Vivian said. A laugh threaded through the words, though Elena caught something sharper beneath the humor, something almost proprietary. "Elena understands the arrangement," Damon said, and each word landed against Elena's chest like a small, precise blow. "We've been clear with each other from the beginning. This marriage serves the peace between our packs. Nothing more was ever promised." "And does that satisfy you?" Vivian asked, quieter now. A pause stretched long enough that Elena's pulse pounded in her ears, waiting. "It has to," Damon said finally, and something in his voice, some rare thread of weariness, told Elena that even he understood the coldness of his own answer, even if he lacked whatever courage or clarity might have moved him to change it. Elena did not wait to hear more. She stepped back from the alcove, careful and silent, and walked away down the corridor with her spine straight and her chin level, refusing to let the tears building behind her eyes fall until she reached the privacy of her own room. Once there, she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of grief, sitting on the edge of her bed with her face in her hands, before she rose, washed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired, yes, but something else had entered her eyes in recent weeks, some flint of resolve that had not existed there 3 years earlier. Elena studied that flint carefully, the way she had learned to study an opponent's stance on the training grounds, searching for the strength hidden beneath the exhaustion. She thought of Nathaniel's words from that morning. Progress is the only honest measure. If Damon would never see her as anything more than a political arrangement, then perhaps it was time she stopped waiting to be seen at all, and started building something for herself instead. The next morning, Elena approached Margaret in the healer's quarters, not for a physical examination this time, but with a request that surprised the older woman. "I want to learn the healing arts," Elena said, "properly. Not just enough to bandage a wound, but enough to be useful to this pack in a way no one can dismiss." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the same careful attention she had shown weeks earlier when examining Elena's bruised wrist. "That's a considerable undertaking, my Luna. It will take years to master fully." "I have years," Elena said. "I intend to spend them building something that belongs to me, regardless of what happens in that study with the door closed." Something like understanding, and perhaps a touch of pride, crossed Margaret's weathered features. "Then we begin with the basics. Herbs first. The body follows after." Over the following weeks, Elena's days took on a new shape entirely. Mornings belonged to Nathaniel and the training grounds, where her strikes grew sharper and her instincts quicker with each session. Afternoons belonged to Margaret's quarters, where she learned to identify healing herbs, to set fractures, to recognize the early signs of fever before they became dangerous. She threw herself into both pursuits with a focus that surprised even her, filling the empty hours that had once been reserved for waiting on a husband who never came. She noticed, too, that the pack itself began to notice her differently. Omega wolves who had once looked past her in the corridors now nodded in respectful acknowledgement. A young warrior with a training injury sought her out specifically for treatment, having heard she'd developed a gentler hand than some of the older healers. Small moments, easily overlooked, but each one settled into Elena's chest like a brick, laid carefully into a foundation she was building without quite realizing, yet, what the final structure would become. Damon remained largely absent from these changes, consumed as ever by council meetings and border negotiations that seemed to multiply with each passing season. When their paths did cross, usually at formal dinners where appearances mattered more than substance, he would offer polite, distracted conversation, entirely unaware that the wife across the table from him had spent that same day learning to disarm an opponent twice her size, or setting the broken arm of a terrified young pup with steady, practiced hands. One evening, nearly 2 months after the night she had overheard the conversation outside the small dining room, Elena found herself summoned unexpectedly to Damon's study. She entered to find him standing at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man carrying some unwelcome burden. "You wanted to see me?" Elena asked. He turned, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like genuine consideration flickered across his features as he looked at her. "The council has raised concerns," he said, "about our lack of an heir. They believe it reflects instability in our alliance." Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, though something cold settled in her stomach at the clinical nature of the conversation. The way Damon discussed the possibility of a child, as though negotiating a trade agreement, rather than speaking of the most intimate matter two people could share. "And what would you have me do about the council's concerns?" "I don't know," Damon admitted, and the honesty in his voice startled her more than any command could have. "I only know that this arrangement cannot continue indefinitely, without consequences neither of us wants to face." Elena studied him for a long moment, this man she had married 3 years earlier with foolish private hopes she had long since buried. She thought of Vivienne's laughter carrying through the garden each evening, of the private supper with wine and dismissed staff, of the warmth in Damon's voice that only ever seemed to surface in another woman's presence. "I'll think on it," she said finally, offering no promises, and left the study before he could see how carefully she was holding herself together. Walking back to her own quarters, Elena understood with sudden, sharpening clarity that whatever choice lay ahead of her, she would no longer make it from a place of desperate hope, waiting for scraps of attention that never truly arrived. She had spent 3 years building her worth around a man who barely noticed her existence except when convenient. She intended, from this evening forward, to build the rest of her life around something far sturdier than his notice. She did not yet know how completely her life was about to change. She only knew, with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through months of secret training and study, that she was no longer the frightened, grateful bride who had stood beneath an arch of white roses 3 years earlier. Something stronger had grown in that woman's place, and Damon Blackwood, absorbed in council concerns and evening strolls with another woman's laughter, had not noticed a single moment of the transformation happening right beneath his own roof. The morning Elena discovered she was expecting a child, she stood alone in her private washroom staring at the small vial Margaret had given her days earlier, the herbal test the healer swore had never once given a false result in 30 years of practice. The liquid inside had turned the pale blue color that meant only one thing, and Elena pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sound that was somehow both a laugh and a sob at once. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long while, letting the news settle over her. A child. Her child. Regardless of whatever else her marriage had become, regardless of council concerns and cold arithmetic and a husband whose warmth belonged to another woman, this small, growing life was entirely her own, and something in Elena's chest cracked open with a tenderness she had not expected to feel so fiercely. She told no one at first, not even Grace, wanting to hold the secret close a little longer, to let it belong only to her before the world descended with its opinions and its politics. She continued her training with Nathaniel that morning, though she kept the pace gentler than usual, and continued her afternoon lessons with Margaret, who studied her with a knowing look but said nothing, respecting whatever privacy Elena needed. It was 3 days later, during a quiet moment tending herbs in Margaret's garden, that Elena finally spoke the truth aloud. "I'm carrying a child," she said, and the words felt strange and enormous leaving her mouth for the first time. Margaret set down the mortar and pestle she had been using and reached for Elena's hands, her weathered face breaking into a smile so genuine it brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. "Oh, my dear girl, that is wonderful news." "Is it?" Elena asked, and the uncertainty in her own voice surprised her. "Whatever else stands unresolved in this house, a child is never anything but a blessing," Margaret said firmly. "You'll be a remarkable mother, Elena. I've watched you these past months. You have more patience and steadiness in you than most Lunas twice your age." The kindness in Margaret's words settled some of the fear knotted in Elena's stomach, though it did nothing to resolve the larger question hovering at the edges of her thoughts. How would Damon receive this news? distracted as he had grown by council pressures, and a woman whose presence seemed to expand a little further into his life with each passing week. She decided to tell him that evening, choosing a moment after supper when the household had quieted, and the two of them might, for once, share a private conversation, undisturbed by advisors or urgent messages. She found him in his study reviewing correspondence, and something in her careful, deliberate entrance must have alerted him that this was no ordinary visit, because he set the papers aside and gave her his full attention for the first time in longer than she could recall. "I have news," Elena said, and found her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I'm expecting a child." For a moment, something genuine passed across Damon's features, a flicker of surprise that softened, briefly, into something almost warm. "You're certain?" Margaret confirmed it. Nearly 3 weeks along, he rose from his desk and crossed the room to stand before her, and for one brief, suspended moment, Elena allowed herself to hope that this news might finally crack open whatever distance had grown between them, might remind him that this marriage, whatever its origins, had produced something worth celebrating together. "This solves the council's concerns entirely," Damon said, and though his tone carried genuine relief, the words landed wrong somehow, focused entirely on politics rather than the child itself, on solving a problem rather than welcoming a new life. "I'll need to announce this carefully, timed well, to maximize the goodwill it brings from the northern Pax." Elena felt the small, hopeful warmth in her chest dim slightly, though she told herself she was being unfair, that of course a king would consider the political implications of an heir, that this did not mean he felt nothing for the child itself. "Of course," she said, "whatever timing serves the pack best." "You've done well," Damon said, and reached out to briefly touch her shoulder, a gesture so small and so rare that Elena found herself treasuring it, despite its inadequacy, despite the ache still lodged beneath her ribs at how quickly the conversation had turned from wonder to strategy. The following weeks brought changes Elena had not anticipated. Word of her pregnancy spread through the pack, and with it came a warmth from the wider community that she had never before experienced within these walls. Omega wolves who had once merely nodded, now stopped to offer genuine congratulations. The kitchen staff began preparing special meals meant to strengthen her and the growing child. Even Nathaniel adjusted her training regimen without being asked, shifting toward gentler forms that protected her condition, while still allowing her to maintain the strength and confidence she had built over recent months. Damon, too, showed small signs of increased attention, though Elena noticed, with a clarity she could not quite silence, that his interest seemed directed more toward the heir than toward her as the woman carrying that heir. He inquired after her health in the mornings, arranged for additional physicians to examine her progress, ensured her meals were properly prepared. But he did not sit with her in the evenings. He did not ask how she felt, emotionally, about the enormous change growing within her body. He did not share in the quiet wonder of it, the way Margaret did, or the way Grace did, both of whom had taken to visiting Elena's quarters each evening simply to talk, to laugh, to marvel together at how quickly Elena's condition progressed. Vivian's reaction to the news proved far less gracious than the rest of the household's. Elena encountered her in the eastern garden one afternoon, the same garden where Vivian and Damon so often strolled together after supper, and found the other woman's expression carefully composed into something that resembled congratulation, but carried, beneath its surface, a current of something far colder. "I hear congratulations are in order," Vivian said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Thank you," Elena answered carefully. "An heir will certainly quiet the council's concerns," Vivian continued, studying Elena with an assessing gaze that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. "Though I imagine it changes little else about your circumstances here." "I'm not sure what you mean," Elena said, though she understood precisely what was being implied. Vivian's smile sharpened slightly. "Only that a child secures your position as Luna, certainly. It does very little to secure a husband's heart, if that heart was never truly available to begin with. I'd hate for you to mistake political relief for personal devotion, Elena. It would be unkind of me not to warn you." The words struck exactly where Vivian had intended them to strike, and Elena felt her composure waver despite months of hard-won steadiness. She thought of a dozen sharp responses, a dozen ways to defend herself against the casual cruelty wrapped so carefully in concern, but in the end she simply straightened her spine and met Vivian's gaze directly. "I appreciate your concern," Elena said, "though I've managed to survive quite well without needing your warnings to understand my own marriage." Something flickered across Vivian's face, surprise perhaps, at the steadiness in Elena's response, so unlike the quiet, retreating woman she had grown accustomed to dismissing. Elena walked away without waiting for a reply, her heart pounding but her steps steady, and allowed herself only once she reached the privacy of the corridor to press a hand against her still flat stomach and breathe through the ache Vivian's words had left behind. That evening, unable to shake the encounter from her thoughts, Elena sought out Grace in the kitchen quarters, needing the comfort of a friend who asked nothing of her except honesty. "She's cruel," Grace said. Once Elena had recounted the conversation, her expression darkening with an anger Elena rarely saw from her gentle friend. "Cruel and calculating both. I've heard the staff talk, Elena. She's been positioning herself carefully these past months, ensuring Damon relies on her judgment more than anyone else's, including yours." "I know," Elena said quietly. "I've known for some time." "Then why do you stay?" Grace asked, not unkindly, but with genuine confusion. "You've built so much strength these past months. You could leave, couldn't you? Return to your family's pack. Raise the child somewhere you're valued properly." Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over as she had turned over so many difficult truths in recent months. "Because this child deserves a mother who fought for what mattered, rather than fled at the first sign of difficulty. And because some part of me still believes, foolishly perhaps, that Damon might yet become the man I once hoped he could be, if only I give him enough time to see clearly what stands right in front of him." Grace studied her for a long moment, something like sad affection in her eyes. "I hope you're right, Elena. I truly do. But promise me you won't wait forever for a man who may never learn to look." "I promise," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, some quiet, growing part of her wondered how much longer that promise could hold against the mounting weight of everything she continued to carry alone. The weeks that followed brought Elena deeper into her pregnancy, and deeper too, into the rhythms of the new life she had built for herself within the Blackwood estate. She continued her lessons with Margaret, now focused increasingly on matters of maternal health and herbal remedies safe for expecting mothers. She maintained gentle training sessions with Nathaniel, who taught her breathing techniques meant to ease the physical strain of pregnancy alongside the combat skills she had spent months developing. She found in these pursuits a sense of purpose and community that had nothing to do with Damon's attention or absence, a foundation built entirely from her own effort and the genuine care of people who had chosen to invest in her well-being. But beneath this growing strength, a quieter worry persisted, one Elena could not entirely silence no matter how firmly she tried. Vivian's presence in the household had not diminished with news of the pregnancy. If anything, the other woman seemed to spend even more time in Damon's private study, their conversations stretching later into the evenings, their easy laughter carrying further down the corridors than Elena's careful ears could avoid overhearing. She told herself again and again that political matters demanded such consultations, that Damon's reliance on Vivian's counsel regarding the Ashgrove trade routes was purely professional, that the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her meant nothing more than old friendship rediscovered after years apart. She told herself these things with the same stubborn determination she brought to her training exercises, forcing her doubts into submission through sheer force of will. But some nights, lying alone in her quarters with a hand pressed against her growing stomach, feeling the first faint flutters of movement that Margaret assured her were entirely normal at this stage, Elena allowed herself, just briefly, to wonder whether all her hard-won strength would prove enough to protect the fragile, hopeful life she carried, both the child growing within her and the quiet, resilient self she had spent months rebuilding from the ashes of 3 years' neglect. She did not yet know how soon that question would be answered, or how devastatingly the answer would arrive. The morning it happened began like any other, gray light filtering through the curtains, the distant sound of the pack waking below. Elena rose slowly, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, and made her way toward Margaret's quarters for her usual morning visit, a routine that had become as comforting as it was necessary in these final months before the child's arrival. She never made it there. Halfway down the eastern staircase, a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her, the world tilting sideways in a way that left her grasping for the railing a half-second too late. She remembered only fragments afterward, the cold stone rising to meet her, a sharp cry that might have been her own voice, and then a darkness that swallowed everything else. She woke hours later in her own bed, Margaret's worried face hovering above her, Grace's hand gripping hers so tightly it ached. The room felt too bright, too quiet, and something in the careful, gentle way Margaret was watching her told Elena, even before a single word was spoken, that whatever had happened on that staircase had cost her something irreplaceable. "Elena," Margaret said softly, and the older woman's voice trembled in a way Elena had never heard before. "I'm so sorry." The words did not need further explanation. Elena felt the truth of it in the sudden, terrible emptiness where hope had lived only hours earlier, in the absence of the faint flutters she had grown so accustomed to feeling. She pressed both hands against her stomach, searching desperately for some sign that Margaret was wrong. that this was some cruel mistake, but the stillness that greeted her searching hands told her everything she needed to know. The sound that left her then was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something raw and shattered that seemed to tear its way up from the deepest part of her chest. Grace gathered her into her arms without hesitation, holding her through the wave of grief that broke over her like something physical, something with weight and force enough to crush the breath from her lungs. "What happened?" Elena managed finally, once the worst of the initial shock had passed enough to allow words. "I don't understand. I was careful. I did everything right. It happens sometimes," Margaret said gently, though her own eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The dizziness, the fall. Sometimes the body simply cannot hold what it's trying so hard to carry. Especially under strain, the mother may not even fully recognize herself. You've been under considerable stress these past months, Elena. It isn't your fault. I need you to hear that clearly. None of this is your fault." Elena heard the words but could not yet make herself believe them. She thought of every difficult evening, every cold conversation with Vivian in the garden, every night spent lying awake wondering whether Damon's heart would ever truly belong to her, and wondered whether the accumulated weight of it all had somehow reached even the fragile, growing life she had carried with such fierce hope. Someone had sent word to Damon immediately, and he arrived within the hour, his face pale and drawn in a way Elena had rarely seen. For a moment, standing in the doorway of her chambers, something in his eyes looked almost broken, and Elena felt a small, aching hope that perhaps this loss, terrible as it was, might finally break through whatever distance had grown between them. "I came as soon as I heard," Damon said, crossing to her bedside. "Margaret says you'll recover fully, physically at least." "Yes," Elena said quietly, though the word felt hollow leaving her mouth. He sat beside her bed, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them. Heavy with grief, neither seemed to know how to voice. Elena studied his face, searching for some sign of the shared devastation she desperately needed him to feel, some acknowledgement that this loss belonged to both of them equally. "The council will need to be informed," Damon said finally, and something in Elena's chest went cold at the words, at the way even now, even in this moment of raw and terrible grief, his mind turned first toward political consequence rather than shared sorrow. "I'll need to manage the announcement carefully to prevent speculation about instability in the succession." "Is that truly your first thought?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though something sharp and disbelieving had crept into it despite her exhaustion. "Our child is gone, Damon, and you're already thinking of how to manage the council's perception of it." Something flickered across his face, perhaps guilt, perhaps simple discomfort at being confronted so directly. "I only meant that we'll need to be prepared for questions. I didn't intend to diminish the loss." "Then what do you feel?" Elena pressed, and she was surprised at her own boldness, at the raw need driving the question past whatever careful restraint she had maintained throughout their marriage. "Tell me honestly for once. Do you grieve this loss the way I do, or does it simply represent an inconvenience to be managed?" Damon was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to reach all the way to his bones. "I grieve it, Elena, truly. But I've spent my entire life learning to separate my feelings from my responsibilities as alpha. I don't know how to do anything else, even now." The honesty in his answer might have moved her, once, in the earlier years of their marriage when she still believed distance could be bridged through patience alone. But 3 years of accumulated neglect had worn away whatever forgiveness might once have come easily, and Elena found herself, in this moment of shared grief, feeling more alone than she had at any point since the wedding day itself. "I need rest," she said quietly, turning her face away from him. "Please, I need to be alone." He left without argument, and Elena listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, feeling the full weight of her isolation settle over her like a physical thing. Grace remained, silent and steady, holding her hand through the long, dark hours that followed, and it was Grace's presence, not Damon's, that carried Elena through the worst of that terrible night. In the days that followed, the household moved carefully around Elena's grief, offering the kind of gentle, wordless support that required no explanation. Margaret checked on her twice daily, monitoring her physical recovery with careful attention while also, Elena suspected, monitoring the deeper wounds that no herbal remedy could fully address. Nathaniel paused their training entirely, understanding without being told that Elena needed time before returning to the training grounds, though he left word through Grace that he would be waiting whenever she felt ready. Vivian, notably, offered no such gesture. Elena encountered her only once during those difficult weeks, passing in the corridor outside Damon's study, and the brief flicker of something across the other woman's face, not quite satisfaction but not quite sympathy either, left Elena with an unease she could not fully articulate. a suspicion she dared not voice aloud even to Grace, though it lingered at the edges of her grief like a shadow she could not quite bring into focus. 3 weeks after the loss, Elena finally returned to the training grounds, finding Nathaniel waiting exactly where he had said he would be, patient as ever, offering no pity, only steady presence and the promise of continued progress. "Whenever you're ready," he said simply, and Elena, grateful beyond words for the absence of pity in his voice, took her stance and began again. The weeks that followed rebuilt something in Elena that grief had nearly hollowed out entirely, a foundation forged not from Damon's absent affection but from her own persistent effort, from Margaret's steady mentorship and Grace's unwavering loyalty and Nathaniel's patient guidance. She threw herself into her training and her healing studies with a focus sharpened by loss, channeling grief into purpose in the only way she had learned how. Damon, for his part, retreated further into his political duties, and the distance between them, already considerable before the loss, widened into something that felt increasingly permanent. He offered no further conversations about grief, no attempts to bridge whatever gap had opened between them in that terrible bedside exchange. Elena stopped waiting for him to close it. It was during this period that Elena began, almost without realizing it, to build quiet alliances beyond the walls of the Blackwood estate itself, corresponding with healers and warriors from neighboring packs through Margaret and Nathaniel's connections, learning of politics and practices beyond the narrow world she had inhabited for 3 years. She did not yet know why she felt drawn to expand her understanding so far beyond her immediate circumstances, only that something in her, some instinct sharpened by loss and neglect both, urged her to prepare for a future she could not yet clearly picture but sensed, with growing certainty, would look nothing like her present. She did not know, in those quiet weeks of grief and rebuilding, that the foundation she was laying, brick by careful brick, would one day become the very thing that carried her away from the Blackwood estate entirely. She only knew that she was, for the first time in 3 long years, building a life that belonged entirely to herself, and that whatever came next, she intended to face it standing on ground of her own making. 6 months after the loss, Elena found herself summoned once more to Damon's study, and something in the tone of the message, carried by a nervous young attendant rather than delivered personally, told her this conversation would not be an easy one. She entered to find Damon standing near the window, exactly as he had been the evening he first mentioned the council's concerns about an heir, and Vivian seated in the chair beside his desk, a position of comfort and familiarity that made Elena's stomach tighten before a single word had been spoken. "You wanted to see me," Elena said, keeping her voice level despite the unease gathering in her chest. "Sit, please," Damon said, gesturing toward the second chair, and Elena noted, with a bitterness she could not entirely suppress, that he had thought to arrange only 2 chairs for what was clearly meant to be a conversation between 3 people, leaving her to stand or accept the implicit inferiority of remaining on her feet while Vivian sat comfortably beside the desk. She remained standing. "The council has grown increasingly vocal," Damon began, "about the future of the succession, particularly given recent circumstances. They've suggested, and I've begun to consider, that perhaps additional support in matters of governance might ease some of the pressure we're facing." "Additional support," Elena repeated carefully. "Vivian has offered to take on a more formal advisory role," Damon continued, and Elena noticed how carefully he avoided her gaze as he spoke, how his eyes drifted instead toward the papers scattered across his desk. Given her experience with the Ashgrove territories and her long-standing relationship with our pack, the council believes her guidance would prove invaluable during this uncertain period. "I see," Elena said, though she did not fully, not yet understanding the full shape of what was being proposed. Vivian spoke then, her voice smooth and measured, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation carefully in advance. "I understand this may feel uncomfortable, Elena, but surely you can see the wisdom in ensuring the pack has access to every possible resource during a time of such vulnerability. My role would simply be to support Damon's decisions, nothing more." "Nothing more," Elena echoed, and something in her voice must have carried more edge than she intended, because Damon finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, something almost apologetic in his expression, though not nearly enough to counter the weight of what was unfolding before her. "I want to be honest with you," Damon said, and Elena braced herself, recognizing in his tone the particular quality of honesty that had once, on their wedding night, informed her that this marriage would never carry warmth beyond duty. "Vivian and I share a history that predates our marriage considerably. I won't pretend that history doesn't inform the trust I place in her judgment now. And what exactly does that mean for my position in this household?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the roaring in her ears. Nothing changes regarding your title, Damon said quickly, as though this reassurance might soften whatever blow was coming. You remain Luna, but I think it would serve everyone's interests if Vivian took on greater responsibility in matters of council and governance, allowing you to focus on other priorities within the pack. Elena stood very still, processing the careful diplomatic language Damon had wrapped around what was, at its core, an announcement that he intended to formalize his reliance on another woman's judgment over her own, in her own household, before her own eyes. And if I object to this arrangement? She asked quietly. I hope you won't, Damon said, and something in his tone carried the weight of a decision already made, regardless of whatever answer she might offer. I believe this serves the pack's best interests, Elena. I need you to trust my judgment on this. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena felt every second of it settle into her bones like something physical, a weight she would carry for the rest of her life, she suspected, regardless of whatever choices followed. She looked at Damon, this man she had married with foolish hope 3 years earlier, watched him avoid her eyes with the same careful cowardice he had shown at her bedside months earlier, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that whatever she had once hoped their marriage might become had died long before this conversation, long before even the loss of their child, buried slowly beneath years of quiet neglect she had mistaken, foolishly, for the patient work of building something worth saving. I understand, she said finally, and turned to leave the study without waiting for further discussion, without giving either of them the satisfaction of watching her composure crack. She did not cry that night, not immediately. Instead, she sat at the small desk in her private quarters and began, methodically, to write letters, correspondence to the healers and warriors from neighboring packs she had spent the past 6 months quietly cultivating relationships with, careful inquiries about opportunities that might exist beyond the walls of the Blackwood estate. She did not yet know precisely what she intended to build from these connections, only that some instinct, sharpened by months of careful preparation, told her the time had come to stop waiting for a life Damon would never choose to build with her, and to start constructing one entirely her own instead. Grace found her still writing well past midnight and studied the careful stack of correspondence with quiet understanding. You're planning something, Grace said, not quite a question. I'm planning my future, Elena answered, whatever that ends up looking like. Does it include staying here? Elena set down her pen and looked at her friend, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like genuine clarity settle over the tangled mess of grief and exhaustion she had carried for so long. I don't know yet, but I know it no longer depends on waiting for someone who has already made his choice, even if he lacks the courage to say so plainly. Grace reached out and squeezed her hand, and in that small, steady gesture, Elena found more comfort than she had received from her husband in the entirety of their 3-year marriage. Over the following weeks, Vivian's formal advisory role solidified with an efficiency that spoke to how thoroughly the arrangement had already been planned before Elena ever learned of it. The other woman began attending council meetings alongside Damon, her opinions carrying weight in decisions that had once, at least nominally, fallen within Elena's purview as Luna. Household staff, ever attuned to shifting currents of power, began directing certain questions to Vivian rather than Elena, a subtle but unmistakable erosion of authority that left Elena feeling increasingly like a ceremonial figure rather than an actual partner in governing the pack. She bore this erosion with outward composure, continuing her training with Nathaniel and her healing studies with Margaret, expanding her quiet network of allies among the Omega Wolves and neighboring packs with careful, patient effort. But privately, each small diminishment added another brick to the foundation of resolve she had begun building months earlier, each slight a further confirmation that whatever life she built for herself would need to exist entirely independent of the recognition or affection of the man she had married. It was during this period that Elena first learned, through a careful letter from a healer in the neighboring Ashgrove territories, of growing tensions along a contested border that threatened to erupt into open conflict between two packs neither Damon nor his council had yet turned their full attention toward. The information felt, in that moment, like nothing more than useful knowledge gained through her expanding correspondence. She did not yet understand how significant that knowledge would become, or how directly it would shape the path her life was about to take. She only knew, filing the letter carefully away among her growing collection of correspondence, that she was no longer the frightened, hopeful bride who had once believed patience alone could build a marriage worth having. She had become someone else entirely, someone who understood her own worth even when the people around her failed to recognize it, and that transformation, quiet and steady and entirely her own, would soon prove far more consequential than anyone in the Blackwood estate yet realized. The letter about the contested border sat in Elena's desk drawer for nearly a week before she decided what to do with it. She had learned enough, through months of careful correspondence, to understand that the dispute involved grazing rights along a river that separated the Ashgrove territories from a smaller, less established pack called Thorn Hollow, and that tensions had escalated to the point where both sides had begun quietly arming their warriors, each convinced the other intended aggression. She might once have brought this information directly to Damon, hoping it might prove useful enough to earn even a moment of his genuine attention. She no longer harbored such hopes. Instead, she wrote to the healer who had first informed her of the tension, a steady, thoughtful woman named Charlotte who served the Ashgrove pack, and asked careful questions about the nature of the dispute, about what each side truly wanted beneath their public postures of aggression. Charlotte's response, when it arrived 2 weeks later, revealed something Elena found unexpectedly useful. Both packs, beneath their public bravado, desperately wanted to avoid open conflict, but neither possessed a leader willing to appear weak by proposing negotiation first. It was, Elena realized, a problem that required not military strength but simple, careful diplomacy, the kind of quiet mediation that demanded patience and trust rather than displays of dominance. She thought of the training grounds, where Nathaniel had taught her that the strongest fighters were rarely the ones who struck first, but the ones who understood exactly when restraint served better than aggression. She thought too of Margaret's healing lessons, of how the body often required not dramatic intervention, but patient, careful attention to underlying causes rather than surface symptoms. Both lessons, she realized, applied equally well to the diplomatic puzzle now sitting before her. She wrote back to Charlotte, proposing a careful, informal channel of communication between the two packs, mediated not by either pack's leadership directly, which might feel too exposed politically, but through trusted intermediaries, who could carry proposals back and forth without either side needing to appear the first to seek peace. Charlotte, intrigued by the suggestion, agreed to raise it carefully with her own pack's council, and within weeks, a quiet correspondence had begun flowing between Elena and representatives from both Ashgrove and Thorn Hollow, each message carefully worded to preserve the dignity of both sides, while slowly building toward genuine resolution. Elena told no one within the Blackwood estate what she was doing, not even Grace, though she suspected her friend noticed the additional hours Elena now spent at her writing desk each evening. This was not secrecy born of shame, but rather a quiet, private conviction that this work belonged entirely to her, separate from her marriage, separate from the household politics that had so thoroughly overshadowed her own voice within these walls. For the first time since her wedding day, Elena was building something that no one could dismiss or overshadow, something built entirely from her own judgment and effort. Months passed in this careful, patient work, alongside her continued training with Nathaniel and her deepening studies with Margaret. Her days took on a rhythm that felt, increasingly, like a life she had chosen rather than one imposed upon her. She rose early for training, spent mornings assisting Margaret with the growing number of pack members who sought her healing skills specifically, and spent evenings deep in careful correspondence that was slowly, patiently diffusing a conflict that could have cost dozens of lives on both sides of a contested river. The change in Elena did not go entirely unnoticed within the Blackwood household, even if its true cause remained hidden. Omega wolves who had once merely nodded politely now sought her out directly for guidance, trusting her judgment on matters ranging from minor disputes to questions of pack tradition. Younger warriors under Nathaniel's training began requesting Elena's assistance specifically when facing difficult techniques, having noticed her patient, methodical approach to teaching skills she herself had only recently mastered. Even some of the older pack elders, who had initially regarded the young Luna from Thornfield with polite but distant respect, began seeking her counsel on matters they might once have brought only to Damon or, increasingly, to Vivian. Vivian noticed this shift as well, and her reaction carried an edge of unease that Elena found herself observing with quiet, careful attention. During council meetings, which Elena still attended despite her diminished formal authority, she noticed Vivian's gaze occasionally flickering toward her with something that looked almost like calculation, as though the other woman was reassessing a threat she had previously dismissed too easily. "You've changed," Vivian observed one afternoon, encountering Elena in the corridor outside the council chamber, her tone carrying less of its usual condescension and more of something Elena couldn't quite name. "People tend to, given enough time," Elena answered evenly. "The pack speaks of you differently now," Vivian continued, studying her with an intensity that felt almost like genuine curiosity beneath the careful composure. "I confess I hadn't expected it." "Expected what exactly?" "That you'd find your own strength, rather than simply waiting for someone else to grant it to you." Something in Vivian's voice, for just a moment, sounded almost like grudging respect. though it vanished quickly beneath her usual careful composure. Damon still sees you as he always has, I think. He hasn't noticed the change at all. The observation, delivered without its usual cruelty, struck Elena with unexpected force, confirming something she had already suspected, but had not yet heard spoken aloud by someone outside her closest circle of allies. Damon remained exactly as distracted and oblivious as he had been on their wedding night, still viewing her through the narrow lens of political convenience, entirely unaware of the transformation happening within his own household, within his own wife. Perhaps that's for the best, Elena said quietly, and walked away before Vivian could respond, though the exchange lingered in her thoughts for days afterward, a strange, unexpected moment of near honesty between two women who had spent years locked in careful, unspoken rivalry. The border dispute between Ashgrove and Thornhollow reached its resolution nearly 8 months after Elena first learned of the tension, through a carefully negotiated agreement that redistributed grazing rights along the contested river in a manner both packs found acceptable, an agreement Elena had spent countless evening hours helping to craft through her careful correspondence with Charlotte and representatives from both sides. When the treaty was finally signed, Charlotte wrote to Elena with genuine warmth and gratitude, acknowledging the crucial role Elena's patient mediation had played in preventing what could easily have become a devastating conflict. Elena read that letter alone in her private quarters, feeling a swell of quiet pride unlike anything she had experienced since arriving at the Blackwood estate 3 years earlier. She had built this, entirely on her own, without recognition from her husband, without support from the pack's formal council, using only her own judgment and the careful relationships she had cultivated through months of patient effort. Whatever else her marriage had cost her, this achievement belonged entirely to her, unassailable and undeniable. She did not share this achievement with Damon. She was not yet certain why she kept it hidden from him, only that some instinct, sharpened by years of watching her contributions go unnoticed or dismissed, told her that the moment was not yet right, that revealing this success too early might invite exactly the kind of political calculation Damon brought to every aspect of their marriage, transforming something that belonged purely to her into another piece on his political chessboard. Instead, she continued building. She expanded her correspondence to include leaders from several other neighboring packs, offering her careful counsel on matters ranging from trade disputes to succession questions, building a quiet reputation among pack leadership throughout the region as a mediator of unusual skill and discretion. She continued her training with Nathaniel until her combat skills rivaled those of many of the Blackwood pack's established warriors. She continued her studies with Margaret until she had mastered nearly every healing technique the older woman could teach her. Damon, throughout all of this, remained almost entirely unaware, consumed as ever by council meetings and border patrols, and the growing comfort of Vivian's constant presence at his side. He offered Elena polite acknowledgement when their paths crossed, occasional distracted questions about her well-being, but nothing that suggested he had noticed the profound transformation occurring within the woman he had married, the quiet queen rising steadily beside him, while his attention remained fixed elsewhere. Elena did not resent this oversight, not any longer. She had moved past resentment into something steadier and more useful, a clear-eyed understanding of exactly where she stood and exactly what she had built despite, rather than because of, her marriage. She thought sometimes of the frightened, hopeful bride who had stood beneath an arch of white roses 3 years earlier, and felt, studying that memory, something like gentle compassion for a woman who had not yet learned the lessons life was about to teach her so thoroughly. She did not know yet, standing at this quiet, steady turning point in her life, precisely what the future held. She only knew, with growing certainty, that whatever came next, she would face it as a woman entirely capable of building her own worth, her own alliances, her own path forward, regardless of whether the Alpha King beside her ever learned to see the queen he had overlooked for so long. The ultimatum arrived on an evening so ordinary that Elena nearly missed the significance of what she overheard, walking past Damon's study on her way to the library, where she had taken to spending her evenings reviewing correspondence from her growing network of allies. Vivian's voice carried through the door, sharper than Elena had ever heard it, stripped of its usual careful, measured tone. "I've given you 8 months, Damon, 8 months of advising your council, managing your correspondence, standing beside you at every function, while your wife occupies a title that means nothing beyond ceremony. I need to know where this is going." "You know my position hasn't changed," Damon answered, and something in his voice carried a weariness Elena recognized from countless similar conversations over the years, the sound of a man perpetually caught between competing pressures he lacked the courage to fully resolve. "Your position," Vivian repeated, and Elena could hear the frustration building beneath her words. "Your position is that you married Elena for peace between our packs. that you've never loved her, that your heart belongs to me, and yet you refuse to formalize anything beyond this quiet arrangement we've maintained for years. I need more than your position, Damon. I need a decision." A long silence stretched on the other side of the door, and Elena found herself frozen in the corridor, unable to move, unable to look away from this conversation that was, in its own cruel way, finally offering her the clarity she had sought for years. "What decision would satisfy you?" Damon asked finally. "Set her aside," Vivian said, her voice quiet now but unmistakably firm. "Formally, the council would accept it, given the political stability you've maintained these past years without needing her presence at all. Give me the position I deserve, the position I've earned through years of loyalty and counsel that Elena has never provided." "The Thornfield Pack would view it as a declaration against our alliance," Damon said, and Elena noted, with a bitterness she could no longer suppress, that his objection concerned political consequence rather than any genuine consideration of what such a decision would mean for her as a person, for the years of her life she had invested in this marriage. "Then manage the politics as you manage everything else," Vivian said. "I've watched you navigate far more delicate situations than a single pack's disappointment. I won't wait forever, Damon. I deserve better than remaining a secret arrangement conducted behind closed doors." Elena did not wait to hear Damon's response. She had heard, in that single exchange, everything she needed to understand with perfect, devastating clarity. Whatever value she had built for herself these past years, whatever alliances and skills and quiet reputation she had cultivated through her own effort, none of it had ever mattered to the man she had married. He had never seen her as anything beyond a political convenience, easily set aside the moment maintaining the arrangement grew inconvenient enough. She walked away from that door with a steadiness that surprised her, given the magnitude of what she had just overheard. She did not cry in the corridor. She did not rush to Grace's quarters seeking comfort, though she knew her friend would have offered it without hesitation. Instead, she walked directly to her own chambers, sat at her writing desk, and began, with careful, methodical precision, to review every piece of correspondence she had accumulated over the past year, every alliance she had built, every skill she had mastered, assessing with clear eyes exactly what resources she now possessed to build whatever came next. She thought of Charlotte, the healer from Ashgrove who had become something like a genuine friend through their months of careful correspondence regarding the border dispute. She thought of the leaders from several other neighboring packs who had come to value her counsel and discretion. She thought of Nathaniel's patient training, of Margaret's thorough instruction, of every skill and relationship she had built entirely on her own merit, without needing Damon's recognition or support. She was not, she realized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, a woman without options. She was not the frightened, powerless bride who had arrived at this estate 3 years earlier, with nothing beyond her willingness to serve a marriage she had not chosen. She had built, in the years since, something far sturdier than the affection Damon had never offered her, and that foundation now stood ready to carry her, wherever she chose to go next. She did not confront Damon that evening. She did not demand answers or explanations, did not give him the opportunity to offer whatever careful political justification he might construct for the conversation she had overheard. Instead, she wrote a careful letter to Charlotte, asking a question she had never before dared to voice aloud, even to herself. Would the Ashgrove Pack, she asked, have any interest in an alliance that included her own permanent residence among them, offered in exchange for the continued mediation and counsel she had provided these past months? Charlotte's response arrived within a week, carrying a warmth and enthusiasm that brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes, tears of relief rather than grief, for perhaps the first time in longer than she could remember. The Ashgrove Pack, Charlotte wrote, would welcome Elena not merely as a resident, but as an honored member of their leadership council, recognizing the invaluable role she had already played in securing peace along their contested border. If Elena wished to relocate permanently, the Pack's own Alpha, a steady and thoughtful leader named Edward, would personally ensure her position and protection were formally established. Elena read the letter 3 times before setting it carefully aside, allowing herself, for just a few private moments, to imagine a life built entirely on genuine welcome rather than grudging tolerance, on recognition rather than neglect. The image settled into her chest with a warmth she had not felt in years, and something in her resolve solidified into absolute certainty. She began, in the days that followed, the careful, quiet work of preparation, gathering what belongings mattered most to her, finalizing correspondence with Charlotte regarding the practical details of her relocation, and slowly, painfully, preparing herself for the conversation she knew she owed Grace, the friend who had stood beside her through every difficult year of this marriage. Grace received the news with tears, and, eventually, understanding, though her sorrow at losing Elena's daily presence was tempered by genuine relief that her friend had finally found a path toward the recognition and respect she had so long deserved. "You should have left years ago," Grace said, gripping Elena's hands tightly during their private conversation. "Perhaps," Elena admitted, "but I don't think I was ready, years ago, to build the life I needed to build first. I needed to become someone capable of standing on her own, before I could walk away toward something better." "Will you tell him?" Grace asked, "before you go?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of the study door, of Vivienne's ultimatum, of years of careful conversations that had never once produced the honesty or warmth she had once hoped her marriage might contain. "No," she said finally, "I don't think words would reach him now, even if I offered them. I think the only message that will truly reach Damon is my absence itself, and even then I suspect he may take considerable time to understand what it means." Grace nodded, understanding without further question, and Elena felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the quiet, settled peace of a decision made entirely on her own terms, built from her own strength, answering to no one's approval but her own. She did not know, packing her final preparations in the days that followed, precisely how Damon would eventually receive the news of her departure, or how long it would take him to understand the full weight of what he had lost. She only knew, with growing certainty, that whatever came next belonged entirely to her, built from years of quiet, patient effort that no one within the Blackwood estate had ever fully recognized, until the moment it carried her, finally, toward the life she deserved. 3 days before her planned departure, Elena requested a private meeting with the PAC's council, a meeting she framed carefully as a routine discussion of ongoing diplomatic matters, giving no indication of the true significance behind her request. She arrived with a carefully prepared document, the culmination of over a year's patient work, and presented it to the assembled elders with the same steady composure she had learned on the training grounds under Nathaniel's careful instruction. "This represents a formal peace agreement between the Blackwood PAC, the Ashgrove Territories, and the Thorn Hollow PAC," Elena said, laying the document before the council. "It resolves the border dispute that has threatened conflict along the contested river for well over a year, establishing shared grazing rights and a framework for ongoing cooperation between all 3 territories." The council elders studied the document with visible surprise, several exchanging glances of clear astonishment as they recognized the thoroughness and sophistication of the agreement before them. "This is remarkable work," one elder said finally. "Who negotiated these terms?" "I did," Elena said simply. "Through correspondence with representatives from both PACs over the past year, I felt it important to bring genuine value to this council, regardless of whatever role I've been asked to occupy in recent months." She did not elaborate further, did not mention Vivienne's diminished regard for her contributions, did not reference the countless evenings of careful, patient work that had gone into building this achievement entirely without recognition or support from her own household. She simply left the document with the council, along with careful notes detailing the ongoing relationships she had built with Charlotte and other leaders throughout the region, ensuring the Blackwood PAC would retain the benefit of these alliances regardless of her own continued presence within its walls. She did not sign the document with any claim to credit beyond a simple notation identifying her as the mediator responsible for its negotiation. She wanted the PAC to benefit from the peace she had secured, wanted the achievement itself to stand as proof of what she had built, but she felt no need to attach her departure to any dramatic announcement or confrontation. The work would speak for itself, in time, regardless of whether anyone chose to properly credit her contribution. The council's reaction, predictably, sparked considerable discussion. Word of the remarkable diplomatic achievement spreading through the estate within hours. By evening, even Damon had heard news of the agreement, and Elena, passing his study on her way to finalize her final preparations, heard him discussing it with evident confusion with one of his advisors. "She negotiated this entirely on her own?" Damon asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "Without consulting the council at all?" "For over a year, apparently," the advisor answered. "Quite remarkable work, if the terms hold as well in practice as they read on paper." Elena did not pause to listen further, continuing instead toward her own quarters, feeling a quiet, private satisfaction at having finally demonstrated, undeniably, the full measure of what she had built during years Damon had spent barely noticing her existence. She did not need his acknowledgement now. The achievement belonged to her regardless of whether he ever fully understood its significance. That evening she completed her final preparations with Grace's help, packing only what mattered most, leaving behind the elaborate gowns and jewelry that had marked her position as Luna, keeping instead the simple, practical belongings that reflected the life she had actually built for herself these past years. Her healing supplies, carefully organized correspondence with allies throughout the region, and a small collection of personal items that carried genuine meaning rather than mere ceremonial value. "Are you certain about this?" Grace asked, watching Elena fold the last of her belongings into a single traveling bag. "More certain than I've been about anything in years," Elena answered. "I'll miss you terribly," Grace said, tears gathering in her eyes despite her earlier composure. "You could come with me," Elena offered, though she suspected, even as she spoke the words, what Grace's answer would be. "The Ashgrove Pack would welcome you as warmly as they've welcomed me." Grace considered this for a long moment before shaking her head gently. "My family remains here. My roots are here, even if the household politics have never been kind to either of us. But I'll write to you, Elena, constantly. And I expect you to write back, in equally exhausting detail." Elena laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound she had not managed in longer than she could remember, and embraced her friend tightly, grateful beyond measure for the loyalty and warmth Grace had offered so consistently throughout the difficult years of her marriage. She sought out Margaret next, finding the older healer in her quarters preparing herbal remedies for the following day's patients, and the conversation that followed carried the particular tenderness of two women who had built something genuine together over years of shared work. "You've become a remarkable healer," Margaret said, studying Elena with evident pride. "The Ashgrove Pack is fortunate to gain your skills." "I learned everything from you," Elena said. "You learned the techniques from me," Margaret corrected gently. "The wisdom to apply them with such patience and care. That came entirely from your own heart. Never forget that, Elena, wherever your path leads next." Her final visit before retiring for what would be her last night within the Blackwood estate took her to the training grounds, where she found Nathaniel finishing his evening rounds, checking the security of the estate's perimeter, with the same careful diligence he had shown throughout her years of training under his guidance. "I hear congratulations are in order," Nathaniel said, his weathered face breaking into a rare, genuine smile. "The peace agreement. Remarkable work, my Luna." "Thank you for everything you've taught me," Elena said. "I wouldn't have found the courage for any of this without your training." "You found the courage yourself," Nathaniel said firmly. "I only taught you the skills to trust what was already inside you. That courage was always yours, Elena. I merely helped you recognize it." She left the training grounds that evening with a heart full of gratitude for the genuine relationships she had built during her years within these walls, relationships that had nothing to do with her marriage to Damon, and everything to do with her own persistent effort to build a life of value and purpose regardless of the neglect she had endured. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of her preparations, Elena walked one final time through the Eastern Garden, where she had spent so many painful evenings watching Damon and Vivian stroll together after supper. The garden was empty now, quiet beneath a canopy of stars, and Elena allowed herself a few final moments of reflection, thinking of the frightened, hopeful bride who had arrived at this estate 3 years earlier, thinking of everything that young woman could not yet have imagined about the strength she would eventually build. She felt, standing in that quiet garden for the last time, not bitterness, but something closer to gratitude, strange as that seemed. The years of neglect had cost her more than she could easily measure, had cost her moments of genuine partnership and warmth she deserved and never received. But they had also, in their own painful way, forced her to discover a strength and capability she might never have found had her marriage offered the easy comfort she had once hoped for. Tomorrow, before dawn, she would leave this estate behind entirely, carrying with her every skill and alliance and piece of hard-won wisdom she had built during these difficult years, walking toward a life that finally, genuinely welcomed the woman she had become. Whatever came next, she felt certain, would be built entirely on her own terms, recognized and valued by people who had chosen to see her clearly rather than overlooking her existence in favor of easier, more convenient arrangements. She did not know, standing beneath those quiet stars, precisely how Damon would react to her departure, or how long it would take him to understand the magnitude of what he had lost. She only knew, with complete and settled certainty, that she was ready, finally, to walk away toward the life she had built for herself, regardless of whether the Alpha King beside her ever fully grasped what he had failed to protect. Rain began falling just before dawn, soft at first, then steadier, drumming against the stone walls of the Blackwood estate as Elena made her final preparations to leave. She dressed quietly in the gray half-light, choosing simple, practical clothing suited for travel rather than any garment that might mark her as Luna of this household, a title she was leaving behind, along with everything else that had defined her existence within these walls for 3 long years. Grace met her at the servants' entrance near the eastern wall, exactly as they had arranged the night before, carrying a small satchel of provisions for the journey ahead. Charlotte's escort should be waiting at the northern crossroads, Grace said quietly, glancing nervously toward the sleeping household behind them. You have enough time before the household wakes properly. Thank you, Elena said, embracing her friend one final time, feeling the weight of everything Grace's loyalty had meant throughout the difficult years of her marriage. For all of it, I couldn't have survived this house without you. Write to me the moment you arrive safely, Grace said, her voice thick with unshed tears. And Elena, whatever happens, whatever he eventually understands, or fails to understand, know that you deserved so much better than what this house offered you. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice fully in that moment, and turned to make her way through the quiet garden toward the estate's outer wall, where a narrow gate led toward the northern road. The rain fell steadily now, soaking through her traveling cloak, mixing with the tears she finally allowed herself as she walked away from the only home she had known for 3 years. Tears not of regret, but of the particular grief that comes from finally releasing something that had never truly served her, however long she had hoped it might. She did not look back at the estate's tall stone towers rising behind her through the gray morning rain. She had said her true goodbyes already, to Grace and Margaret and Nathaniel, to the people who had genuinely valued her presence and contribution. Whatever remained inside those walls, whatever conversation Damon might eventually have with Vivian about the formal position she had demanded, none of it belonged to Elena's future any longer. Charlotte's escort waited exactly where promised, a small group of Ashgrove warriors led by a steady, quiet woman named Hannah, who greeted Elena with genuine warmth despite the early hour and heavy rain. Charlotte sends her regards, Hannah said, helping Elena onto a waiting horse. The Alpha himself asked us to ensure your journey remained comfortable and safe. Please thank him for his consideration, Elena said, settling into the saddle, feeling something loosen in her chest at the genuine care evident in even this small gesture, a stark contrast to years of neglect she had endured within the Blackwood estate. They rode through the morning rain in companionable, mostly silent understanding, Hannah occasionally pointing out landmarks along the northern road, sharing small details about the Ashgrove territories that awaited them. Elena listened with growing anticipation, feeling something like hope, genuine and unguarded, blooming in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. Back within the Blackwood estate, morning arrived with its usual routine, household staff beginning their daily tasks, guards changing shifts along the estate's perimeter walls, entirely unaware that the Luna they had grown accustomed to overlooking had already departed hours earlier, walking away from a marriage that had never truly seen her. It was nearly midday before Damon noticed her absence, distracted as he had been by an early morning council meeting regarding trade negotiations with a southern territory. He sent a servant to Elena's quarters with a routine message regarding evening plans, only to have the servant return moments later with news that the Luna's chambers stood empty, her personal belongings notably absent from the wardrobes and shelves that had held them for 3 years. Find her, Damon commanded, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his features for the first time in longer than his advisors could easily recall. Search the estate thoroughly. The search revealed nothing, of course, beyond Grace's careful, practiced ignorance regarding her friend's whereabouts, an ignorance Damon's advisors accepted without suspicion, given Grace's evident distress at the news of Elena's disappearance. It was only when a servant discovered the peace agreement Elena had left with the council 3 days earlier, now formally reviewed and approved, bearing her careful notation identifying herself as its primary architect, that the pieces began, slowly, to assemble themselves in Damon's mind. He read the document twice, sitting alone in his study long after the search parties had returned with no further information, studying the careful, sophisticated terms Elena had negotiated over the course of an entire year without his knowledge or support. He thought of the countless evenings he had spent absorbed in council meetings and Vivian's easy companionship, entirely unaware that his wife had been quietly building something of genuine consequence in the background of his neglect. Vivian found him there that evening, still studying the document with an expression of dawning, uncomfortable realization. You look troubled, she observed, settling into the chair beside his desk with her usual easy familiarity. Elena is gone, Damon said quietly. Gone where? I don't know yet. But she left this behind. He gestured toward the peace agreement. She negotiated this entirely on her own, over the course of an entire year, without ever mentioning it to me or the council. Vivian studied the document with visible surprise, though something in her expression suggested a discomfort that went beyond simple surprise at the diplomatic achievement itself. This is considerable work, she said finally. I hadn't realized she possessed such skill. Neither had I, Damon admitted. and something in his voice carried a weight of genuine self-reflection that Vivian had rarely heard from him before. That night, alone in his study long after Vivian had retired, Damon found himself thinking, for the first time in years, truly considering the woman he had married 3 years earlier, the frightened, hopeful bride who had stood beside him beneath an arch of white roses. He thought of her quiet dedication during the early years of their marriage, of the child they had lost, of the countless evenings he had left her waiting alone while he pursued council matters, and Vivian's comfortable companionship instead. He thought, too, of the recent months, the transformation he had noticed only in passing, the growing respect she seemed to command among the Pax Omega wolves and warriors, the whispered admiration from council elders regarding her diplomatic skill. He had noticed these things, distantly, without ever truly understanding their significance, without ever pausing to consider what it meant that his wife had built such considerable strength and reputation, entirely separate from his own attention or support. He summoned Grace to his study the following morning, hoping desperately for some clue regarding Elena's whereabouts, but found only steady, unwavering loyalty in her responses, a refusal to betray her friend's trust regardless of Damon's growing desperation. It was only through careful investigation among the estate's correspondence records, a task he assigned to his most trusted advisor, that Damon finally learned of Elena's extensive communication with Charlotte and the Ashgrove territories over the preceding year, communication that suggested, with growing certainty, exactly where his wife had likely traveled. He did not immediately pursue her. Some part of him, he recognized with uncomfortable honesty, feared what he might discover if he confronted the full weight of what his neglect had cost him. He spent the following days in uncharacteristic distraction, unable to focus fully on council matters, finding himself instead reviewing the peace agreement repeatedly, studying its careful, sophisticated terms, recognizing in each clause the evidence of a mind far more capable than he had ever allowed himself to properly appreciate. Vivian, sensing his distraction, grew increasingly insistent about formalizing her own position within the household, but Damon found himself, for the first time in their long history together, hesitating to give her the answer she sought. Something had shifted within him, slowly and uncomfortably, since discovering the depth of what Elena had built entirely without his knowledge or support, and that shift, small as it seemed at first, would soon grow into something he could no longer easily ignore. 3 weeks after Elena's departure, Damon finally traveled north toward the Ashgrove territories, arriving unannounced at a border checkpoint where Ashgrove warriors regarded him with a mixture of caution and formal courtesy, befitting a visiting Alpha King. He requested an audience with Alpha Edward, and was received within the hour, ushered into a modest but well-appointed hall, where the Ashgrove leader waited with careful, measured composure. "Alpha Damon," Edward said, rising to greet him with the formal respect due between neighboring pack leaders. "I confess I hadn't expected your visit, though I suspect I understand its purpose." "I'm looking for my wife," Damon said, dispensing with unnecessary diplomatic preamble. "I have reason to believe she may have traveled to your territories." Edward studied him for a long moment before answering, and something in his measured, careful expression suggested he had anticipated this exact conversation, had perhaps even discussed its likelihood with Elena herself in the weeks since her arrival. "Elena has indeed joined our pack," Edward said finally. "She arrived several weeks ago, and I confess, Alpha Damon, that our territories have benefited considerably from her presence already." "I need to speak with her," Damon said, and something in his voice, an uncharacteristic vulnerability that surprised even himself, seemed to soften Edward's initially cautious posture slightly. "That decision belongs entirely to her," Edward said. "I won't compel her to see you, nor will I prevent it, should she choose otherwise. I can send word of your presence, and she may decide for herself how to proceed." Damon waited through what felt like an interminable hour, pacing the modest guest chamber Edward had provided, reviewing in his mind every conversation, every missed opportunity, every small cruelty of neglect he had inflicted upon Elena throughout their 3 years of marriage. He thought of the wedding night when he had coldly informed her that this marriage would never carry warmth beyond duty, of the countless evenings he had left her waiting alone while pursuing Vivian's comfortable companionship instead, of the devastating loss they had suffered together and the clinical, political response he had offered, rather than genuine shared grief. When Elena finally entered the chamber, Damon found himself momentarily unable to speak, struck by the transformation evident in her bearing, her composure, the quiet, settled confidence that had replaced the careful, watchful uncertainty she had carried throughout their marriage. She looked, he realized with a jolt of painful clarity, like a woman who had genuinely found herself, entirely independent of anything he had ever offered her. "Elena," he said finally, her name carrying more weight in that single syllable than he had managed to convey throughout their entire marriage. "Damon," she answered, her voice steady, carrying none of the anxious deference that had once characterized her interactions with him. "I need to understand why you left," he said. "Truly understand. Not the political version, not whatever careful explanation might satisfy the council. I need to understand what I failed to see." Elena studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was carefully weighing how much honesty this conversation deserved, how much of her genuine feelings she was willing to offer a man who had spent 3 years demonstrating so clearly how little her feelings had ever mattered to him. "You never saw me at all," she said finally, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Not truly. From our wedding night forward, you made it clear that our marriage existed purely as political arrangement, and I accepted that, foolishly perhaps, believing respect and partnership might grow from even such a beginning. But you never offered either. You offered distraction and distance, and a heart that belonged, from the very beginning, to someone else entirely." "I know," Damon said, and the admission seemed to cost him something significant, some careful armor he had maintained throughout their marriage finally cracking beneath the weight of genuine self-recognition. "I understand now, far too late, everything I failed to offer you, the peace agreement you negotiated, the respect you've earned throughout this region, the strength you built entirely without my support. All of it exists because I gave you no other choice but to build it alone." "Yes," Elena said simply, offering no reassurance, no easy forgiveness to soften the weight of his admission. "Is there any possibility?" Damon began, and something in his voice carried a vulnerability Elena had never once heard from him throughout their entire marriage. "Any possibility that you might return, that we might build something genuine between us now, given everything I finally understand?" Elena considered the question carefully, thinking of 3 years of accumulated neglect, of a lost child grieved alone, of countless evenings spent in cold, distant conversation, while warmth and laughter belonged to someone else entirely. She thought, too, of the life she had built here in these weeks since her arrival, the genuine welcome and respect Edward's pack had offered her, the sense of belonging and value she had found among people who had chosen to see her clearly from the very beginning. "No," she said finally, and the word carried no bitterness, only quiet, settled certainty. "I don't believe I could return to a life built on the foundation our marriage represented, regardless of whatever understanding has finally reached you. I spent 3 years waiting for you to see me, Damon. I've spent these past weeks discovering what it feels like to be genuinely seen by people who never needed convincing to offer their respect and warmth. I won't return to waiting." Damon absorbed this answer in silence, and something in his expression suggested a grief far deeper than Elena had ever witnessed from him throughout their marriage, a genuine recognition, perhaps for the first time, of exactly what his neglect had cost him. "I understand," he said finally, though the words carried a hollow weight that suggested understanding had arrived far too late to change anything meaningful about their shared history. "I wish you well, Damon," Elena said, and meant it, surprising herself with the genuine warmth of the sentiment, despite everything that had passed between them. "I hope you find, eventually, whatever version of happiness suits you best, but I've found mine here, among people who value my presence rather than merely tolerating it." She left him standing alone in that modest guest chamber, walking back toward the life she had built for herself among the Ashgrove territories, toward Charlotte's genuine friendship and Edward's respectful leadership, toward a future built entirely on her own strength and the recognition she had finally found among people willing to offer it freely. Damon returned to the Blackwood estate 3 days later, the journey home carrying a weight of realization that would linger for the remainder of his years as Alpha King. He ended his arrangement with Vivienne within the month, recognizing, finally, that whatever comfort her companionship had once offered, it had cost him something far more valuable in the process, a partnership with a woman whose worth he had failed to recognize until circumstances forced the recognition upon him, far too late for reconciliation. He governed the Blackwood pack for many years afterward, respected by his council, competent in matters of trade and border security, but carrying, always, the quiet knowledge of what he had lost through years of careless neglect. He heard, occasionally, news of Elena's continued success among the Ashgrove territories, of her growing reputation as one of the region's most skilled and respected diplomatic mediators, of the genuine warmth and admiration she commanded among people who had chosen, from the very beginning, to see her clearly. Elena, for her part, built a life of genuine purpose and belonging among the Ashgrove pack, her diplomatic skills eventually earning her a formal position on Edward's council, her healing abilities benefiting pack members throughout the region. her friendship with Charlotte and Hannah deepening into the kind of genuine, unwavering loyalty she had once believed marriage itself might offer, only to find it instead among people who had never needed convincing to value her presence. She thought occasionally of the rain-soaked morning she had walked away from the Blackwood estate, tears streaming down her face not from heartbreak over losing Damon's love, which she had long since recognized she had never truly possessed, but from grief over years spent waiting for recognition that would never genuinely arrive. She had walked away that morning believing herself broken, uncertain, grieving a life she had invested 3 years building. She understood now, looking back from the vantage of the genuine happiness and respect she had found, that those tears had marked not an ending, but the beginning of a life finally built entirely on her own terms, recognized and valued exactly as she deserved, long after the Alpha King who once overlooked her had finally, painfully, learned to understand precisely what he had lost.